Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to gently lead you into the quiet corridors of forgotten centuries, where shadows flicker by candlelight, where cobblestones remember footsteps long vanished, and where the mysteries of the past breathe softly beneath the dust of time. Nestle in, pull the blanket closer, and let the hush of history settle in around you. You see, tonight, we will drift through 15 peculiar tales, eerie, unresolved and morbid, each rooted in the fog-shrouded world of medieval Europe. They are not just legends, they are riddles that time forgot to answer. Our journey begins not with kings or saints, but with silence. The silence of a vanished village, swallowed whole by earth and rumour. It was the autumn of 1271, in the forested borderlands between present-day Poland and Slovakia. The leaves had begun to fall, cloaking the narrow paths in rustling carpets of gold and brown. Traders who passed along the winding road spoke of a hamlet named Matusowa, tiny, isolated, and hidden so deeply among the trees that few could find it without guidance. And then it was gone. Not in the way that villages often fade, abandoned, burned, or drowned. No, Matusowa vanished entirely. Overnight. A local tanner named Borivoy, who lived in the neighbouring settlement of Nowy Sącz, was the first to report it. He arrived one crisp morning with a cart of pelts, expecting to exchange them for bread, herbs, and a vial of gooseberry mead. Instead, he found only empty huts. Chickens wandered untethered through the lanes. Doors hung open, creaking ever so gently in the morning wind. A pot of broth sat beside an extinguished hearth, still warm. There were no signs of struggle. No bodies, no blood, no tracks, just silence. When a priest from Nowy Sącz, Father Zdzislaw, was summoned to bless the grounds and search for clues, he wrote in his journal, they left behind their shadows but not their names. It is as if the earth sighed and they were folded into it. Local folklore soon erupted with explanations, as is often the case when certainty fails. Some said the villagers had angered the forest spirits, Lessi, ancient beings of root and branch who walk like men and vanish like smoke. Others whispered that the people of Matusowa had dabbled in necromancy, drawing the ire of the church and the punishment of heaven. But the most chilling rumour came from an old woman named Dragomira, once a midwife in the village, now long exiled. She claimed it began with a boy named Jakub. He was no older than 10, she said, and pale as snow, with hair the colour of fresh ash and eyes that shimmered like moonlight. He had been found, not born, in the forest, nestled within the twisted roots of an oak tree after a terrible storm. He did not speak for his first 3 years, and when he did, it was only to whisper things that hadn't yet happened. A calf dying, a chimney collapse, a woman's stillborn child. The villagers feared him, but they also listened to him, because he was never wrong. On the eve of the feast of St. Wenceslas, Dragomira said Jakub had stood in the village square, barefoot and shivering, and announced in a voice that was not his own, "The ground remembers. The ground is hungry. We should not have come." The next morning, the village was empty. Historians later tried to locate Matusowa's remains. Some believed it had been swallowed by a sinkhole or destroyed by a rapid landslide, its structures crushed into the earth and buried under centuries of forest. But no geological records support this. No mass grave was found, no stone markers, no relics, nothing. Even its mention faded from regional tax records after 1271, except for one. In the Royal Archive of Krakow, a document from 1272 lists a tithe receipt signed not by a living scribe, but with a symbol, a spiral, inked in red wax. The tithe came from the lands of the Hollowed. No such place appears on any modern map. And when an academic named Tomasz Wieczorek tried to follow the trail in the 1980s, he disappeared in the same region. His last recorded note, scrawled in the margins of a field journal, read only, "He is still a child, but not for much longer." We may never know what truly happened to Matusowa, whether the villagers fled, were taken, or became part of something older than memory itself. But when the wind rustles through those deep forests in early autumn, some locals swear they hear footsteps, soft and quick, trailing just behind. A boy's whisper, maybe. A warning. Something that sounds like, "We were warned." And so we leave the woods behind for now and follow the shadow of the next unsolved mystery that slumbers beneath the surface of medieval history, quietly waiting for someone to notice. Far from the dense, whispering forests of Matusova, there lies a region in the craggy north of England where stone walls stretch like veins across the hills, and ancient abbeys stand in solemn ruin. In one such abbey, Caldwell Priory, a mystery grew not from disappearance but from presence, an intruder of impossible nature who defied the very laws of time and logic. Caldwell Priory was founded in 1148, a modest order of Cistercian monks known for their strict silence, tireless work and devotion to copying sacred texts. Built into the crook of a mist-covered valley, the priory was a place of routine and reflection, tucked far from worldly matters. But something arrived there, beginning in the year 1182, and it changed the priory forever. It began with a light. Brother Aldwin was the first to see it. He had risen before dawn to gather water from the brook that bordered the eastern edge of the grounds. As he approached the bank, he noticed something peculiar. A pale blue shimmer moving just beyond the trees. Not fire, not torchlight, but something cooler, like moonlight wrapped in fog. He paused, blinked, and it vanished. He mentioned it quietly during their evening meal, in the single hour each day when speech was permitted. Several of the older monks dismissed it as sleep-blurred vision, yet within the week others had seen it too. And then came the sound. Not bells, not chanting, but a sort of humming, low and constant, as if the earth itself were groaning beneath their feet. It did not come from the chapel or the fields. It seemed to rise from the walls, from the stones. Brother Peregrine described it as the breath of something watching. Their abbot, Father Dunstan, initially refused to acknowledge these accounts. Caldwell was a place of discipline, not superstition. But his resolve cracked when the first manuscript was altered. It was the scriptorium's crown jewel, a copy of the Book of John, meticulously recreated over 6 years. When Brother Cuthbert went to illuminate the margin on folio 43, he found something already there, in ink no one had touched, in handwriting no one recognised. It was a face. Pale and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and an open mouth caught in the shape of a silent scream, the skin drawn too tight, the neck stretched thin as if pulled by invisible hands. They tore the page out, burned it and prayed. The next morning, the image had returned, not as ink, not as drawing, but as a watermark embedded into the page as if it had been pressed into the parchment itself. After that, the priory grew colder, not just in temperature, but in feeling. The air lost its warmth. Candles flickered more violently. Food spoiled faster. And every night, always at the same hour, just before the midnight bell, that same humming returned, pulsing through the floors. Then came the appearance. Brother Simeon, the infirmarian, claimed he saw a figure in the cloisters. Tall, motionless, cloaked in something that looked like tattered wool but shimmered like frost. He thought it was a beggar who had slipped in past the gates. He followed it around a corner and found nothing, only a sudden pressure in his ears as though the world had held its breath. When Simeon returned to the infirmary, all of the water in the wash basins had frozen solid. It was the middle of summer. Soon every monk had seen the figure at least once, always just at the edge of sight, always near a shadowed corner or beneath a rotted beam, never moving, never speaking. They tried to record its appearances. Brother Edwin kept a ledger hidden beneath his mattress, updating it only in candlelight. He believed the figure was following a pattern, a spiral path inward toward the chapel. On the feast of St. Benedict, the final entry in the ledger was scrawled in haste. "It is beneath the altar now, watching upward, we dare not chant." After that night, Edwin never wrote again. He refused to speak, eat, or acknowledge the world around him. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. He died a month later. Father Dunstan made the decision to close the chapel. It was boarded up, sealed with wax and forbidden to all. But that did not stop the visits. Visitors from nearby towns reported strange echoes while passing the priory's walls, dissonant chords like a choir that could not harmonise. Children complained of dreams, all sharing the same image, a face stretched thin, peering upward from beneath the floor. It was then that Rome was contacted. The Vatican sent a Benedictine investigator, Prior Urbanus of Avignon, known for examining claims of divine or diabolic intervention. He arrived in late October of 1183. According to the priory's last surviving register, he stayed for precisely 3 nights, On the fourth morning he departed without a word, leaving behind only a sealed scroll addressed to the bishop. The scroll simply read, "This presence is neither saint, sinner, nor spirit. It is the echo of something that was never human, trying to become remembered. Coldwell must be emptied. Let the walls forget." And so they did. By spring of 1184, the monks had scattered to other abbeys. Coldwell was left to crumble. No attempts were made to restore it. Over time, it became a ruin. Moss devoured its stones, ivy swallowed its gates. But even now, if one were to wander those valleys and step too near the chapel's remains, if you leaned too close to what was once the altar, you might hear it, that low, persistent hum. And you might notice, just for a moment, that your breath has fogged in warm air, that something cold is watching from below. The face beneath the floor has not forgotten. It waits, still, unfinished. Far to the south, in the sun-bleached plains of Provence, nestled between low olive groves and the shimmering heat of distant hills, stood a fortress monastery known as Sainte-Eveline. It had walls thick enough to repel siege and a tower so tall it cast a noon shadow that reached the nearby riverbank. From the outside, it was a testament to the order's devotion, fortified not just against raiders, but against temptation, doubt, and the creeping chaos of the outer world. But within its walls a quiet horror bloomed, one that did not shout or scream, but whispered and wrote. Sainte-Eveline was home to 32 monks in the spring of 1239. Each had taken a vow of silence more extreme than most, communicating only through parchment and gesture. Theirs was a cloister of scribes, chosen for their skill in preserving and illuminating ancient texts. They worked by day in long, windowless halls where the only light came from high slits in the stone. By night, they slept in stacked chambers, their beds bare but clean, their routines unbroken. It began with a manuscript, one that should not have existed. Brother Elric discovered it during a routine inventory. He was cataloguing volumes in the Southern Archive, a room sealed for decades due to mould. It had been recently reopened after a harsh winter forced the monks to gather all usable materials for kindling or recovery. Tucked behind a crumbling collection of Latin treatises was a book wrapped in leather, its binding smooth as wax, its surface oddly warm. It had no title. Inside were pages that shifted with each viewing, text that appeared and disappeared between blinks, letters that flowed like water before settling into words. The language was unplaceable. Not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, and yet it felt familiar, as though it was trying to be understood, reshaping itself for the reader's eyes. Brother Elric brought it to the abbot, Father Morin. Within a day, the abbot ordered the manuscript placed in a locked chamber beneath the scriptorium. He refused to explain why. 3 nights later, the first monk began to write in his sleep. Brother Adrian was found at his desk, fingers ink-stained, quill in hand, his eyes were closed. His lips unmoving, but the parchment before him bore a message written in perfect, elegant script, a style not his own. "They are listening through the vellum. Do not speak their names." More followed. Every night a different monk would be found at a desk or on the floor, hand outstretched, eyes closed, leaving behind phrases that chilled even the most devout. "We are the bones beneath the ink. This is not memory, it is hunger. Stop reading, stop remembering." Father Morin began burning each page upon discovery. He favored the transcription. He ordered fasting, prayer and isolation, but still it continued. Then came the drawings. In the margins of hymnals, within the folds of record books, even scratched into the wax of sealed tablets, strange, spidery illustrations began to appear. Twisted trees with human teeth, doors with no hinges, eyes where no eyes should be. Some were no larger than a coin. Others stretched the length of a scroll, but all were drawn in the same hand. One by one, the monks began to change. It was subtle at first, a slowness in speech, a pause too long before answering. Then came the bleeding from the eyes, the trembling, the murmurs in languages none could translate, and always the compulsion to write, to leave words behind, on cloth, on walls, on skin. The youngest among them, Brother Gervais, carved a passage into the stone floor of his cell, with nothing but his fingernails before collapsing. The message, once translated by an outsider, read, "They taught us letters so they could crawl inside. Each mark is a window." When the Bishop of Arles was informed, he dispatched an investigator, a scholar named Lucien de Clary, known for his studies of linguistic possession. He arrived with ink, scroll, and a cold determination. He believed it to be mass hysteria, perhaps brought on by mold spores or psychological strain. He spent 1 week within Saint Aveline. His final journal entry, found stitched into his cloak lining after his death, read, "It is not a book, it is a mouth, and we are the ones teaching it to speak." After Lucien's death, the church sealed Saint Aveline. The doors were bricked. The monks who survived were relocated, none permitted to speak of what they had seen. The manuscript, unnamed and undestroyable, was locked in a leaden box and buried beneath the monastery's bell tower. A cross was carved above it, not as a blessing, but as a warning. And still sometimes, when the mistral wind blows across the Provençal plains, travellers swear they hear a faint scratching from within the old stone walls, as though something inside is writing, trying to write itself into the world, one word at a time. Beyond the windswept hills of Wales, nestled in a fold of mist-shrouded moorland where roads twist like forgotten thoughts, there once stood a village called Caer Henlas. It no longer appears on maps. In fact, even in the oldest records of Gwynedd, it is mentioned only once, as a footnote beside a list of parishes erased by time. Yet the tale of its fate still murmurs through local folklore, especially when the moon is high and the peat bogs bubble with unseen breath. The story begins in 1296, during a season known locally as Blynyddoedd y Glar Tywel, the years of the quiet rain. For nearly 3 seasons, the skies above Caer Henlas wept without thunder, without wind. The rain came softly and endlessly, like a hush poured over the land. Crops grew pale, thatched roofs darkened with moss. And the villagers, it was said, spoke less with each passing week. The silence was contagious. At first it was attributed to the weather, a common gloom, but soon even the laughter of children dulled, their games played without songs. The blacksmith ceased his humming. The chapel bell stopped ringing, and though no edict was passed, no punishment threatened, the people of Caer Henlas simply stopped speaking, all except one. Eerie, the village's healer and herb woman, was the last voice in the valley. She spoke to her goats, her herbs, the damp stones she arranged in circular patterns each morning. She was a woman of the old ways, half mistrusted, half needed, with a headscarf always damp and fingers stained green with yarrow and sage. When the silence became complete, she travelled house to house. She found doors unlocked, hearths lit, food uneaten. The villagers were present, alive, but their eyes looked far beyond her. When she asked questions, they only blinked. Their mouths moved, but no sound came. Then she began to dream. Each night, she saw a figure of water standing at the edge of the village well, not dripping, not flowing, but shaped of rain itself. It had no face, only the suggestion of one as if sketched in vapour, and it watched her. On the 7th night, the figure stepped into her home in the dream. When it moved, puddles appeared. When it turned, the room rippled. It said nothing, but its silence pressed into her chest like weight. She awoke gasping. The next morning, the village well overflowed. This had never happened. The rains were constant, yes, but the well had been dug centuries ago with ancient drainage. It should not have risen, yet the water now spilled over the stone lip, cold and clear, forming rivulets that crept into the cobbled streets. Aya peered down. What she saw was not her reflection. Instead, there was a face, pallid, serene, unfamiliar, floating just beneath the surface, eyes wide open, the mouth slowly open too, revealing no teeth, no tongue. Just darkness. She stumbled back, and when she looked again, the water was calm. Later that day, the silence turned to absence. The baker's house was empty. So was the mill. The blacksmith's anvil sat untouched beside a still glowing fire. Ira walked from door to door, finding no one. Beds were unmade. Boots still wet with mud sat by the door, but every person in Caer Henlas had vanished. Only the sound of the rain remained. In her desperation, Ira climbed the hill overlooking the village, where an old standing stone had stood since before the Romans. There she gathered her herbs, mugwort, rowan bark, angelica root. She burned them in a shallow dish of brass and began to chant. She called to the rain. She begged for speech. She offered her voice, her breath, her memory, anything in return for understanding. And the rain listened. It thickened. The sky did not darken. No storm came. But the droplets grew heavier, more deliberate. Each one struck the earth like a whisper turned solid. And then slowly they began to rise. Upward, not fall. Rise. Rain reversed as if the sky was inhaling. From the well, water lifted from puddles. Steam curled upward. And from the misty air emerged the figure again, not in a dream, not in shadow, but before her on the hilltop. A man-shaped emptiness filled with rain. A vessel. And in a voice not hers, not human, not even alive, it spoke. She who breaks the hush must carry the hush. She who remembers must become the forgetting. Era tried to answer, but her voice failed her. The rain stopped, and for the first time in 3 years the moor was silent in truth. When travellers passed through the region months later, they found the village intact. Tools, livestock, all untouched. But there were no people. Only one figure sat on the hill by the standing stone, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. Era. She did not speak, she did not move. But when examined closely, her skin bore tiny lines, not wrinkles, but script. Microscopic letters covering every inch of her like a language written by the storm itself. Each droplet a syllable, each word a part of the silence. The village of Caer Henlas was never settled again. The rain returned to its normal rhythm, but locals claimed that when you walked alone near the old stone in the fog, you could hear faint voices, not crying, not shouting, but speaking all at once in a language made of water. And somewhere in that chorus, if you listened closely, a single name rose like a thread through mist. In the bone-dry heart of Castile, where the sun bakes the earth into stone and the wind slices like knives through the valleys, there once stood a small fortress town named Calvaria de la Sombra. Built atop a jagged plateau, it commanded no great road, guarded no treasures, and bore no legacy of royal blood. Yet its name lingered like smoke in the memories of nearby villages, always spoken low, always with the sign of the cross drawn quickly afterward. The ruin still stands, though few dare climb the winding path to reach it. For those who do, what greets them is not decay alone, but something stranger. A silence not born of absence, but of refusal. A silence that hums beneath the stones, waiting to be broken. Calvaria's story begins in the year 1312, during a time of relative peace. The Reconquista had not yet reached this forgotten corner, and the villagers lived as they had for generations, tilling the stony soil, praying at the chapel, and reporting to the Castellan who ruled from the stone tower at the edge of the cliffs. The Castellan's name was Don Esteban. He was a fair man, though sombre, a widower with one daughter, Isabel. She was known for her beauty, yes, but more for her strange demeanour. She spoke seldom and seemed always to be listening. Listening not to people, but to walls, wells, animals, and, as some whispered, to the wind itself. At the centre of Calvaria stood a well unlike any other in the region. It was circular, built not of brick but of black volcanic stone, smooth and veined like marble. The water within was always clear, even in drought, cold even in summer. The townspeople believed it sacred, though no saint was tied to it, and Isabel visited it daily, leaning over the edge, whispering. One night in July, during the full moon, the town awoke to a sound none could describe. Not thunder, not screaming, but a vibration that rattled crockery and teeth alike. Dogs howled, horses broke their ties, and the well, for the first time in living memory, bubbled with rising water. The next morning, Isabel was missing. Don Esteban locked the gates and ordered a full search. Every building, every field, every path down the cliffs. Nothing. Not even a footprint. 3 days passed. On the 4th, she returned. She walked into the village barefoot, her dress soaked, her eyes unfocused. She said only one thing before collapsing. It is awake now. She slept for a day and a night, waking only to drink water from the well. When she rose again, her hair had turned entirely white. The villagers began to dream. At first, they believed it coincidence, poor sleep perhaps, but each night brought the same visions, the same sequence. A descent into darkness, a staircase spiralling downward, the sound of bells, far too many, ringing beneath the earth. And something breathing. The children began speaking in their sleep, chanting, repeating syllables that did not belong to their language. The chapel bell rang of its own accord, at first only at dawn, then at midnight, then at no fixed time at all. The priest, Father Hernando, went to silence it and was found hours later at the altar, weeping, his mouth sewn shut with fishing wire. He could not say who had done it. Then the writing appeared. On doors, on walls, on skin. Letters that no one recognised, burned into surfaces as if with acid, carved into tree bark, drawn in ash on windows, always in spirals, always around the same phrase, descend with me, or be pulled downward. Don Esteban tried to flee with his daughter. His guards refused to open the gates. He screamed at them, called them traitors, cowards, but their eyes held no malice, only understanding. They said in unison, "There is no gate now, only the mouth." That night, Isabel disappeared again. This time she did not return alone. The next morning the well was no longer a well. Its water had receded, replaced by a pit so deep no light could touch the bottom. And from it rose a sound, steady, echoing, like wet stones grinding in rhythm. And Isabel stood beside it. She no longer looked human. She was taller, her limbs longer, her face stretched, not grotesquely, but wrong, like a portrait redrawn by someone who had forgotten what people should look like. Her mouth did not move, yet a voice filled the town. "Your prayers have fallen long enough, now your bodies must follow." And then the descent began, not forced, not screamed, voluntary. One by one, the townspeople walked to the well, children first, then women, then men. They stepped into the pit with no resistance, no struggle, only silence, only acceptance. Don Esteban tried to stop them. He begged, he pleaded, he held the hands of those he had known since childhood, but they smiled at him as though waking from a long illness. Only a handful resisted. They fled into the hills. Their accounts, decades later, form the only written memory of Calvaria's fate. They said the entire town, every house, every tree, every stone, fell silent on the same day. The birds no longer circled the cliffs. The river changed course, avoiding the plateau entirely, and the well closed. Not filled in, not destroyed, closed, like a mouth shut tight after feeding. When the site was excavated in the 1800s by a small team of curious historians, they found the ruins of Calvaria almost untouched by time, except for the central square where the well had once stood. In its place was a black slab, polished smooth, impossible to scratch. Carved into it was a single phrase in a script no one has yet translated. But some believe, when placed before a mirror, it reads, "The first city has tasted again, and it remembers." No flowers grow there now. No birds sing, only the wind turning in slow, deliberate circles like something deep below is still exhaling. In the marsh-laced flatlands of northern Frisia, where the fog lingers so long it seems to forget the sun, there once stood a monastery known simply as De Groove. Its name meant the trench, though no record survives of why it was called so. Few ventured to it willingly. The land itself pushed against visitors, boggy paths swallowing cartwheels, strange bird calls echoing at all hours, and air thick with a metallic tang, as if rust floated unseen through every breath. The monks of De Grove were a quiet order, long detached from their brethren on the continent. They maintained no vineyards, accepted no pilgrims, and received no letters. Their days were spent in isolation, copying old ecclesiastical texts and tending to sheep that grazed upon ghostly dew-covered fields. But there was something beneath the monastery, something older than the stone laid upon it, something the monks were sworn not to name. It began, as it often does, with a crack in the ground. In 1304, after a mild tremor shook the marshland, a rarity in that still waterlogged region, the monks found a fissure in the crypt beneath the chapel. Only a finger's width at first, running along the far wall like a scar, but wide enough that when one leaned close, one could feel cool air rising from it. And something else. A scent. Faint. Sweet. Not like rot or mould, more like honeysuckle. But wrong. Brother Nicholas was the first to fall ill. He had been tasked with assessing the crack. After 2 days spent sketching the damage and testing the wall's integrity, he began to mutter in his sleep. Words no one understood, languages that twisted and collapsed as they were spoken. His lips blistered. His fingers blackened, but he refused to stop speaking. Even in delirium, his mouth moved. He died with his eyes wide open, his pupils the size of pinpricks, fixed on the ceiling. And that night the first bell rang, but not the monastery bell. This was deeper, fainter. A tone that came not from above, but below, through the floor, vibrating gently through the stone tiles. It rang once, then fell silent. The monks prayed, they fasted, they covered the fissure with cloth, then stone, then sealed it with wax mixed with holy oil. The next night the bell rang twice. By the end of the week it was tolling 6 times at midnight, echoing with dreadful precision. And with each toll more fissures appeared. Tiny, hair-thin cracks laced through the floors and walls, like veins crawling outward from a hidden heart. The abbot, Father Geert, attempted to bless the crypt. He descended alone, carrying a crucifix and a censer filled with frankincense. He never emerged. When two brothers went after him, they found the censer on the ground, still warm, but no sign of Father Geert. Only a sound like distant whispering rising from the crack. Not words, not wind, but something between, like breath that had learned to echo. The following morning, the sheep were found dead, not torn, not poisoned, simply lying flat on the marsh, eyes rolled back, tongues dry and grey. Their bodies bore no wounds, but each had their hooves turned inward, twisted unnaturally as if pulled from within. The monks began to sleep in shifts, keeping vigil over the chapel. They poured wax over the floor. They sang hymns continuously, though their voices grew raw. Still, the bells continued. 7, 8, 9 chimes. Then the writing began. On the walls, in soot, on the pages of Bibles, in ink that none of them had used. Thin spirals of symbols, tight at the centre, expanding slowly outward. When they attempted to scrub them away, they reappeared hours later, larger, clearer. One phrase emerged in Latin, repeated at every doorway. Deorsum non vadit solus. He does not descend alone. Panic began to take root. Some monks attempted to flee across the marsh. They were never seen again. The one survivor to return, Brother Marius, arrived barefoot, soaked and raving. He had torn out his own tongue, stuffing it in the pocket of his robe. Written across his chest in dried blood was a single word: listening. That night, the ground beneath the chapel finally gave way, not in a collapse but a withdrawal, as if the earth beneath had tired of holding them up. The floor of the crypt sank nearly a foot, and with it the altar cracked straight down the centre. From the widening fissure came not darkness but a soft amber glow. And then the music began. Not a melody, not of human design, but a chorus of tones, high and thin, stretched like sinew across the vault of night. No mouths formed them, no hands played, but the sound filled the entire monastery. Some monks covered their ears, others wept, a few sat very still, their faces empty, as though something had been plucked out from behind their eyes. By dawn, the music had stopped. So had the monks. When a traveller passed through 2 weeks later, he found the buildings intact, empty. The fields were overgrown, the sheep pens were abandoned. In the chapel, a single figure remained, a monk kneeling before the broken altar, unmoving, turned to salt. His robe still clung to his body, but his skin had crystallized, a grey-white effigy, mouth slightly open, as if trying to sing. The fissure beneath him was sealed, smooth and cold, like a healed wound. A surveyor sent by the church later recorded a strange phenomenon. Every compass brought into the groove spun counterclockwise. Birds refused to land. Water left in a bowl overnight turned a faint pink, then evaporated entirely before sunrise. The monastery was never reclaimed. Locals built a wall of stone and prayer around its ruins. Even today, the marsh avoids it. The reeds do not grow near the chapel, the fog moves around it, and sometimes, just as the sun sets, if the wind is still, a single tone can be heard, rising from beneath the earth. The tell. High in the Carpathian Mountains, where clouds clutch at jagged peaks and pine forests huddle close like watchful sentinels, there once stood a keep known as Te Chetatea Vantului, the fortress of the wind. Its stones were dark and veined with silver. Its windows narrow, its towers twisted slightly as if leaning towards something unseen. For centuries it remained unclaimed, ungoverned and unspoken of, perched on a cliffside where no paths led and no roads dared ascend. Those who lived in the valleys below did not speak its name aloud. They knew the winds that howled from its crags were no mere currents of air. They carried voices, murmurs, sounds that pressed against the eaves of their homes at night and turned milk sour by morning. The fortress was said to have been abandoned since the mid-1200s. No lord ruled it, no banners flew. But in the year 1341, a group of pilgrims made their way into the region. They were led by a man named Brother Florin, a former scholar of Brasov turned mystic. He had seen the fortress in a dream, described it in detail before ever laying eyes on it. The serpent-like patterns on its northern wall, the collapsed western gate, the windowless tower they would later call the Watcher's Spire. They believed it was the final threshold, a place where prayer would thin the veil between worlds. They reached it after 13 days of climbing. Of the 12 who began the journey, only 7 reached the fortress. The rest had vanished without sign or injury, simply stepping away from the group mid-step, mid-sentence, and never returning. The remaining pilgrims did not speak of these vanishings. It was understood. The fortress was listening. Once inside, they found no signs of life, but the dust was disturbed. Footprints, not theirs, tracked the inner halls. Rooms bore signs of recent presence. A hearth still warm, a cup half full of dark liquid, a book open to a page written in no known script. The walls breathed with the wind. It coiled through corridors like smoke, but without scent, without cause, and sometimes it laughed. Brother Florin began to speak less. He turned his eyes toward the watcher's spire and remained there, seated on the stone floor, for hours at a time. When asked what he saw, he replied only, "It's not what I see, it's what sees back." At night, the others slept uneasily. The wind carried words now, not Romanian, nor Latin, nor any earthly tongue, but the meaning came through. Commands, questions, warnings. One by one they began to change. Brother Daishin carved circles into the stone walls with his fingernails. Not crude spirals, but precise geometric loops that expanded and overlapped, forming diagrams that hurt to look at. When asked what they were, he whispered, "It's how it remembers us. It can't forget if we are written." Sister Ilincha began singing before dawn, songs without melody, long and droning, rising in pitch with each verse. The birds stopped returning to the forest edge. The air grew heavier. The youngest, Brother Mihai, tried to leave on the 7th day. He made it down the first ledge before screaming. The others found him curled at the foot of the path, blind, his eyes intact but turned completely white. He kept repeating the same phrase, "The sky was too close, it touched me." On the 10th night, the stars disappeared, not hidden by cloud, but gone. The sky above the fortress was not black, but empty, as if someone had scraped the firmament away. No moon, no pinpricks of light, only void. The wind had stopped, the silence roared in its place, and in the stillness, something knocked. Once, twice, thrice. The sound echoed from beneath the stone floor of the watcher's spire. They descended the spiral staircase by torchlight. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if time thickened the farther they went. At the bottom, they found a door of iron, sealed not by lock but by symbols, deeply etched, pulsing faintly with a dull red glow. Brother Florin pressed his palm against it. The door opened inward with a breath. What lay beyond was not a chamber but a chasm, a vertical shaft descending into nothingness. No stairs, no ladders. Only a current of wind rising slowly from its depths, carrying the scent of distant myrrh and the unmistakable chill of awareness. Something spoke from below, not in words, not in voice. It spoke directly into each of them. They collapsed, screaming, laughing, weeping. Some forgot their names, some forgot their limbs. One forgot how to breathe. Florin remained standing. He turned to the others, face serene, and said, "We are on the wrong side of remembering." Then he stepped into the chasm, and the wind returned. It blew out the torches. It surged upward, filling every hallway, slamming doors, extinguishing sound. And with it came a shape, not a figure, not a creature, but a presence that stretched thin across the walls, as if the very stone had begun to shift its allegiance. The others tried to flee, only one succeeded, Sister Ilincha. She was found wandering the foothills days later, barefoot and burned. Not from fire, but from cold, a cold that etched patterns into her flesh, spirals within spirals. Her tongue had been split, her eyes sealed shut with wax. She lived only long enough to draw something in the dirt with trembling fingers. A tower, a single window, and wind curling from its base like smoke. At the bottom of the drawing, a word repeated 3 times. "Alza! Alza! Alza! It hears! It hears! It hears!" To this day, no one who ascends the cliffs toward Cetatea Vantului returns. The fortress still stands, watching, listening. The wind is louder near its gates, as if carrying stories back to the void from which they came. And on some nights, when the mountains groan and the pines lean away, the wind changes. It speaks your name. In the rolling green lowlands of Flanders, where the rivers braid themselves through sleepy villages and the fog, like old parchment, through the fields, there once stood a leprosarium known as Sint Pieter ter Draven. It was a quiet place, removed from cities and trade routes, surrounded by hedgerows and orchards. The walls were high, not for defence but for separation, not to keep danger out, but to keep sorrow in. The afflicted who came here were given peace, dignity, and time. But within the final decade of the 13th century, something else was offered. Something not asked for, something never spoken aloud. They called it the veil. At first it was only a story, a gentle lie passed among the dying, a myth to ease pain. They said that if you stayed long enough, if you were quiet enough, still enough, the veil would come to you. It would not heal, it would not speak, but it would remove. Remove what? None could say. Not disease, not death. But something deeper. The grief behind the ribs. The scream behind the smile. The first record comes from a nun named Sister Marguerite, who arrived in 1292 from Bruges. She was known for her diligence, her steadiness of mind. Her letters to her abbess were detailed, formal, always precise, until one was not. In the 5th month of her stay, her handwriting changed. The lines grew longer, the letters curled like tendrils, margins were filled with tiny swirling symbols. The language remained Latin, but it read like poetry carved in sleep. I have seen the veil move. It is not cloth, it is not mist, it is thought made visible. She described an encounter one night, waking to silence so thick it seemed to have weight, as though sound had been pressed out of the world. The moon hung low and red, casting a steady glow through her cell window. At the foot of her bed stood a shape, not a person, not a shadow, but a suggestion of form, as though someone had sketched the idea of a figure and forgotten to fill it in. She wrote, "It watched without eyes. I felt it inside my lungs. It removed something. I cannot name it, but I am lighter now." After that letter, she stopped writing altogether. When a priest from Ghent came to investigate the increasingly unusual reports from St. Peter to Draven, he noted the unnatural quiet. The lepers, usually murmuring prayers or weeping in the chapel, now sat still for hours, unmoving, their eyes fixed on corners of the room where no one stood. They did not speak to him, they did not resist him. But he recorded something odd. Their bandages were always clean, unnaturally so. No matter how many he watched bleed, the next morning the cloths were white again, as though someone had unwrapped, washed and replaced them during the night. The nuns refused to speak of it. Their leader, Mother Alina, smiled politely, but answered no questions directly. Her eyes were pale and distant, as if listening to music no one else could hear. The priest departed. He never submitted a formal report. Months later, during a harvest that turned bitter and sudden, the nearby villagers noticed something strange. The orchard closest to the leprosarium bore no fruit that year. Its trees were untouched, their bark smooth, but every leaf turned grey by midsummer. The grass beneath them did not grow. Birds avoided the branches. Dogs would not pass the fence, and at night, soft light flickered between the trees. A new rumour spread, that the veil had moved beyond the walls, that it had grown hungry. One boy, no more than 9, went searching with his older brother. They thought it a ghost story, a game. They never reached the orchard, only the younger returned. He was found at dawn, curled against the roots of a tree, eyes open, humming a tune no one recognised. He would not speak. His tongue had vanished, not cut, not severed, simply absent, as if he'd never had one. When asked what had happened, he wept silently and pointed toward the monastery. That week the orchard was burned, but the fires would not catch. The leaves curled, the bark blackened, yet no flame took hold. Only smoke rose, thick, white and sweet-smelling like sap or incense. It clung to clothes, to hair, to skin. Those who inhaled it reported dreams. The same dream, a hallway of impossible length, lit from nowhere, lined with mirrors that did not reflect. At the end, the veil. A presence. Not menacing, not warm, only waiting, and behind it something large, breathing. Slow. One man, a former soldier turned shepherd, carved a phrase into his barn door before vanishing. The veil does not come for death, it comes for the thing we carry toward it. By 1299, St. Peter to Draven was sealed. The bishopric claimed it had succumbed to plague, but no bodies were buried, no plague carts were dispatched, no smoke rose from the chimney again. The building still stands. Its walls are covered in vines, its gates rusted shut, but through the cracks in the mortar a faint scent still lingers. Sweet, clean, almost holy. Travellers say if you press your ear to the stone near the old chapel, you'll hear not voices but breathing. And if you wait long enough, something will press back, something that remembers the shape of sorrow and hungers only for what can never be named. Deep within the Black Forest of what is now southwestern Germany, past the curling ravines and the sunless thickets where moss grows thick as fur on every surface, there once stood a hamlet named Waldstein. Few maps recorded its presence. It was not a village of note, no relics, no markets, no wars passed through its boundaries. Yet among the woodsmen and charcoal burners of the region, its name carried weight. A hush would fall whenever it was spoken. They called it the place with no shadows. It's difficult to understand how such a phrase could be literal. And yet, for those who found their way into the hollow where Waldstein once sat, there was an immediate sense of wrongness, a feeling not of danger, but of absence. An absence of movement, of time, of shadow itself. The legend, obscure as it is, begins in the winter of 1260, during an unusual celestial event. That year, the moon did not appear for 7 consecutive nights over the region. Not hidden by clouds, not veiled by storms, simply missing. The stars shone, the sky was clear, but the moon's face was gone. The villagers of Waldstein recorded this in their church ledger. No Luna, no tides. The wolves will not howl, we are watched from beneath. On the 8th night, the moon returned, but the shadows did not. This change went unnoticed at first. In the pale daylight of snow-covered fields, one might not immediately miss the dark silhouettes cast by trees or chimneys. But by the 3rd day, the villagers understood. Nothing cast shadow anymore. Not people, not tools, not buildings. Even candles burned without creating contrast on the wall. Father Eberhard, the village priest, was the first to suggest that they had crossed into something. Not a curse, not a punishment, but a thinning. A space where the rules had bent. He instructed the villagers to avoid the chapel bell, to close all mirrors and to stop recording time. But something had already begun. Children reported seeing shapes behind them that would not follow. They described silhouettes that forgot to belong. One boy refused to enter his own home, screaming that a flat man was waiting just inside the threshold. The livestock refused to graze. Fire would not behave, burning upward in strange flickering ribbons, sometimes stopping mid-air like fabric underwater. And then the fog came, thick, white, soundless. It poured in not from the forest, but from the wells, rising in slow pulsing waves that crept along the ground. At night it would pool in homes, inching up the walls, wrapping around furniture like gauze. It smelled of dust and pine and something else, like paper that had never been written on. The villagers began to vanish. Not en masse, not violently. They would simply be gone. A basket of wood at the door. Soup still warm in the pot. A broom leaning against a wall. The space they had occupied still humming faintly with presence, but emptied. And always, in the corner of the room, a dark outline on the floor. Not quite shaped like the missing person, not quite matching their size. Like a shadow that had remained behind. The priest kept a journal until the very end. It was found decades later, sealed in a box beneath the chapel floor. The final entries were scattered, written without dates. One reads, "The fog is not the danger, the fog is the message. The flat ones come before the turn." Another, "I watched my own reflection blink before I did. It is not mine anymore." And lastly, "We are the last light, and now we flicker." Eventually, no one remained. What became of the villagers is unknown. Some believe they passed into another state, not death, not disappearance, but transformation. Not into spirits or beasts, but into impressions, possibilities, traces of what had been. The forest swallowed the hamlet. Trees grew over the cobbled lanes, roofs caved under moss, the chapel bell fell and cracked. But the hollow remains strangely untouched by time. No birds sing there. Snow does not settle on its soil. And the fog still visits. Not from rain or mist, but rising from below, as if the earth remembers something it refuses to say aloud. In the early 1700s, a scholar from Strasbourg attempted to map the site. He brought with him instruments to measure light, depth, and elevation. In his journal, he notes an experiment conducted at noon. "Held my hand against the stone wall, no shadow. Yet I cast it before I arrived. It stayed at the village edge. I watched it linger." He left the village that same evening. 3 weeks later, he was found wandering barefoot in the forest, eyes closed, reciting the Lord's Prayer backward in a child's voice. Clutched in his hand was a torn piece of parchment, blank except for a perfect outline of a human figure, drawn not in ink but in some dark, dried substance that soaked through without bleeding. It was his shadow, or what had once been. To this day, hunters and hikers speak of the hollow. They say it feels wrong beneath the feet, that fireflies refuse to blink, that their own reflections glimpsed in water or steel seem to look past them as if distracted by something just behind. And in the hush between wind and stillness, when everything else goes quiet, one might hear something moving, flat, dry and familiar. On the mist-laced cliffs of Brittany's western coast, where jagged rock rises like broken teeth from a sea that never calms, there once stood a convent carved directly into the stone. It was known as Le Couvent des Absents, the convent of the absent. Its name was not poetic, not chosen for piety or sorrow. It was simply a fact. The women who entered its iron gate were not expected to return. Founded in the late 1100s, the convent served no parish. It received no tithes. Its location was not marked on maps, and its existence was rarely acknowledged in the records of the church. Only in private letters, in confessions whispered to certain bishops was it spoken of, always with unease. It was said to house those whom the world could no longer contain, not for sin, but for something stranger. Women who dreamed things before they happened. Girls whose voices caused glass to crack. Widows who spoke languages they'd never learned. All sent quietly and without farewells to the cliffs, to the sisters of the Absentis. At the heart of the convent was a bell that did not ring. It hung in the central chapel, suspended from a thick beam of bleached driftwood, wrapped in seaweed and salt. It bore no clapper. Its mouth was sealed with wax, reapplied every fortnight by the oldest nun, a woman known only as Sir Anemone, whose age no one knew, and whose eyes were said to reflect not the world around her, but something deeper. The bell had not rung in centuries, until the winter of 1328. The winds had been unusually harsh that year. Even the seagulls fled inland. The tides rose higher than memory, gnawing at the base of the cliff like an animal too long starved. One morning, just after the sisters concluded their dawn silence, the wax seal on the chapel bell was found split cleanly down the middle. No one had touched it, no heat had melted it, it had simply opened. And though the bell still bore no clapper, that evening at sunset it rang, only once. A single hollow tone that came not from vibration but from within, like a breath exhaled through bronze. That night the dreams returned. Each sister, whether young novice or ancient matron, reported the same vision, a room of stone beneath the sea, lit by no flame but glowing faintly as if by breath alone. In its centre stood a shape, not a figure but a void, shaped like one, outlined in glistening fishbone and threads of salt. It turned though it had no face, and it whispered though it had no mouth. "You have remembered too much." In the days that followed, 3 of the sisters vanished. No signs of escape. No disturbance in the snow. Their veils and sandals remained beside their beds, their rosaries coiled neatly upon their pillows. The convent doors had remained bolted. The sea, high and black, crashed endlessly below. The remaining women began fasting, praying in shifts. Salt was laid in thick lines across thresholds and window frames. The chapel was closed, but the dreams persisted, and the bell rang again, this time twice. Each toll sounded beneath the ribcage. It did not pass through the ears but sank into the spine, settling deep like an old memory, uninvited. After the second ringing, Sister Marthe began to sing. The melody was simple, repetitive but wrong, not disharmonious, just misaligned, as if it had been meant for a different world. She could not stop. Her throat bled, her lips split, her voice broke and mended again. She sang through sleep, through prayer, through silence, and when she finally fell still, she whispered, "He waits where memory drowns." The sisters began to record everything, pages upon pages of ink, transcribing their dreams, the changes in the sea's rhythm, the tone of the bell. But no ink would stay upon the page for more than a day. By the following dawn, the parchment was clean, not smudged, not torn, clean as though it had never been touched. Only one book remained untouched, the ledger of those who had arrived at the convent, a plain volume bound in grey hide, stored behind the altar. One of the novices, Sister Edeline, opened it to the first page. The names had changed. Where once there had been lists of birthplaces, dates, prayers of intention, now there were only symbols, endless repeated patterns of spirals and slashes, fishhooks and crescent moons, written in salt, embedded into the paper, not applied but grown. The final page bore no symbols, only one phrase, etched so deeply into the parchment that the page had almost torn through. When the third bell tolls, none will remain to remember why. Sir Anemone, the eldest, who had not spoken in over 40 years, rose from her cot that night and walked barefoot into the sea. The tide did not fight her. The water peeled back as she moved, laying bare the rocks and kelp and ancient bones beneath. The other sisters watched in silence from the cliff above as she reached the edge of the submerged stone path, knelt and placed her forehead against the surf. She whispered something, no one heard, and the sea answered. It pulsed, not with tide or wave, but with sound. A third toll, not the bell. Not any bell, but something far beneath, something patient and vast. The stone of the cliff quivered. The birds fell silent. The stars above the convent blinked out, one by one, as if submerged. By dawn, the convent was empty. All that remained were the veils, gathered like petals in the chapel's nave, and the wax seal, whole once more, intact upon the bell, as if it had never been disturbed. To this day, the convent's ruins are unreachable by land. The stone path beneath the waves has vanished. The sea permits no boats near it, and yet on the longest nights of the year, sailors claim to see a faint glow rising from the water, a tower of light, a bell with no sound, and beneath it something vast and ancient, whispering to the tide, remember less, sleep more. Far east of Krakow, where the hills melt into low, trembling plains and mists roll in like tides from a sea that no longer exists, there once lay a village named Żelazna Wola, though by the time it was last spoken of, no one could recall if that had truly been its name. It sat at the edge of a road that ended nowhere, surrounded by ancient fields dotted with stone markers whose inscriptions had been worn to smoothness by wind and time. It was said the soil there never froze, not even in the cruelest winters, and yet no crops grew, no trees took root, no birds nested, no insects buzzed. The land was not dead. It simply refused to remember how to live. The village itself was quiet, its homes low and narrow, all built from the same grey timber that had long since lost the scent of forest. The roofs bowed inward as if hunched in shame. The wells were shallow, the windows were covered, not with shutters, but with layers of fabric stitched tightly across the frames as though sight itself had been outlawed. At the centre stood a tower. Not high, not grand. A squat cylinder of stone with no visible entrance. Just a single window, too small for a person to pass through, always black inside. The villagers called it Sercienia, the shadow's heart. No one claimed to have built it. No one remembered when it first appeared. Yet all agreed it had always been there. It began, or ended, in the autumn of 1303. A girl was born. Her name was Malwina. She did not cry. Her mother, a midwife herself, noticed that the girl did not breathe with the regular rhythm of newborns. Her chest moved only when touched, and only once for every touch. She was quiet, she was cold, but she lived, and her eyes were black, not dark. Black like ink or obsidian or the hollow of a deep tunnel. At 3 years old, she spoke her first words. I see the tower watching. She was not punished. The villagers did not speak of the tower, but they also did not deny it. They simply looked down and nodded, as though the girl had said the weather was turning or that the bread had risen well. From that day on, the tower became active. Each morning, a different villager would wake with a word carved into the wood above their bed. Always a different word, always in their own handwriting, and always a word they did not recognise. Brother, thread, hollow, again, circle, sleep. Some began to burn the carvings away, others buried them beneath layers of cloth. It didn't matter. The next morning the word would reappear, not as ink, not as scratches, but as absence, a hollowing out of the wood itself. Soon after, Malwina stopped growing. Her face remained that of a child, but her thoughts, her tone, aged. Her mother wept often and without reason, and her father spent more time in the fields, pacing in long loops with his hands clenched behind his back. One day, Malwina vanished. The villagers searched, though half-heartedly. No one dared approach the tower, but they found no sign of her. No tracks, no discarded cloth, no open doors. Until evening came, and the window in the tower was no longer black. It glowed, not with fire, not with light, but with something paler, something softer, like the sky seen through fog, something watching back. From then on, each night, a song would drift from the tower. No instrument, no voice, Just melody, impossible to place, impossible to not hear. It passed through walls, through sleep, through silence. And with it came a pressure, gentle but firm, the feeling of memory being rearranged. The villagers began to forget. First it was names, then seasons, then faces. A woman forgot her husband but remembered his coat. A boy remembered how to build snares but not what for. A baker forgot the taste of bread. They wrote things down, lists, notes, prayers. But by morning the ink had bled away, not smudged but thin to water. The paper grew translucent. Their records began to sing back to them when touched. One man tried to leave. He made it past the outer field where the stones no longer bore names and into the trees, thin, gnarled things with bark like paper. He was found the next morning, returned to his bed, mouth open, throat stuffed with folded cloth. Scrawled on his chest, in delicate looping script, "There is nowhere else." By the end of the year, no one remembered the girl. They did not remember the tower, but they feared both, and the window stayed lit. In 1640, a passing monk chronicling local heresies recorded a visit to a strange settlement in the eastern hills. He described the people as pale, serene, forgetful. They spoke slowly, always with pauses, as if listening for approval. They offered him no food, but brought water in bowls shaped like open hands. He asked them the name of their village. They looked to the tower and said in unison, "We wait for her to wake." The monk fled before nightfall. His account ends with a line struck through, but still visible beneath the ink. They dream without closing their eyes. Żelazna has long since vanished from any records. Travellers speak of a clearing in the hills where their voices sound quieter than usual. Where time seems slightly misaligned, where dreams come too quickly and leave behind something small, something like a word you never learned but somehow remember. And far at the centre, a single tower waits, its window still glowing, its breath shallow and patient. In the highlands of northern Italy, tucked between jagged peaks and forested valleys where snow lingers well into spring, there once stood a small Benedictine outpost known as San Severino del Silenzio. It was not a grand abbey, nor even a proper monastery, simply a stone retreat built beside a frozen lake that never thawed, its surface dull and grey, reflecting not the sky but something deeper, something that seemed to move beneath. The outpost housed no more than 8 monks at a time, all sworn to a vow of complete silence, more stringent even than most orders. No chanting, no prayer allowed, no greeting. Their lives were dedicated to contemplation, meditation, and transcription of dreams. Yes, dreams. San Severino was founded in the late 1100s not for public worship, but as a site of dream collection. Each monk kept a journal beneath his cot, writing down the contents of his dreams the moment he awoke. These journals were not read by others. They were burned at the end of each month. The ash was scattered into the lake. It was believed or feared that the lake had once been something else, that before it froze, it had spoken. The dreams, they said, kept it asleep. The earliest mentions of San Severino describe the monks not as servants of God, but as custodi del sonno, keepers of the sleep. What they watched over, what they waited for, was never fully explained. But in the winter of 1322, something changed. The dreams began to repeat. At first, 2 monks reported identical imagery, a hallway made of ribs, an impossible staircase spiralling downward through bone, then a third, then all 8. Identical down to the smallest detail. Even their handwriting began to shift, curling at the ends, the letters thin and elongated, as if their fingers were guided by the same unseen hand. The abbot at the time, Brother Tommaso, had served in silence for over 30 years. He broke his vow for the first and only time when he wrote a letter, not to the church, but to no one. It was unsigned, unsealed, found years later in the wall behind his cell. It read, "We no longer dream as men, the lake dreams through us." They continued to transcribe, even as the ice on the lake began to change. It had always been cloudy, matte, but now it grew clear each day. By early February, one could see several meters into its depths. Shapes began to form, not fish, not rock. Forms that drifted too slowly, that shimmered faintly when unobserved, that seemed to rise the closer one stared. The monks began sleeping longer. Some did not wake for days, their breathing slowed, hearts steady as though resting in some suspended rhythm. When they did awaken, they wept silently and returned to their writing without hesitation. Then, the humming began. Not from the lake, from the stones of the outpost itself. It was barely perceptible, like the sound of tension before a string is plucked. The walls vibrated slightly, bookshelves trembled, candles leaned inward, and the air grew denser, thick with the scent of something sweet and metallic, like lilies buried in iron. The journals, when burned, no longer produced ash. Instead, they crumbled into something fine and crystalline like powdered glass. When scattered into the lake, the water absorbed it with a hiss. By March, the monks ceased leaving their rooms. Each one had turned his cot toward the wall and placed his journal on his chest like a relic. When visitors arrived, pilgrims who had heard rumours of strange visions, they found the monastery empty. Not abandoned. Empty. The rooms were undisturbed, meals prepared, candles still flickering. But no one remained, except for the lake, which had become a mirror. Its surface, now fully transparent, revealed a cavern below, vast, stretching farther than the basin should allow. Structures could be seen in the gloom, pillars, arches, movement, and at the centre of the lake, where the ice was thinnest, floated a shape. Long, pale, curled in a fetal position, not corpse-like, not decaying, but dreaming. Its back rose and fell with the rhythm of sleep, and the humming continued. A decade later, a hermit named Girolamo claimed to have spent a night near San Severino. He had approached the frozen lake out of curiosity, seeking solitude. In his final journal, recovered after his death in a nearby village, he wrote, "I thought it was only water, only stillness, but when I looked too long, it looked back. My name was spoken beneath the ice in my own voice, and then the final page had been removed. Not torn, cleanly cut as if never written. The lake remains frozen to this day, despite summers that have grown hotter, despite climate and time. No snow settles on it, no animals drink from it. But sometimes, rarely, a traveller will hear a sound as they pass. Not words, not wind, but the echo of a pen scratching across parchment just below the ice. And if they listen too long, they may begin to dream that night of spirals made of bone, of breath without lungs, and of something ancient just beneath, waiting for a silence deep enough to rise through. In the bog-choked reaches of Northern Ireland, beyond the desolate peatlands where the ground sighs when stepped upon and the wind carries no scent, there once stood a lone stone chapel known only as Clonmaenach. No records of its founding survive. No church in Dublin or Armagh ever claimed it. It appeared on no pilgrims' maps, and even the most ancient monastic texts refer to it only in footnotes as a place of impossible permanence. For it was said the chapel had always been there, not built, not founded, but revealed. It stood atop a low, weeping hill where no birds perched. The surrounding land was pale with lichen, and the trees, thin, pale yews, bent away from the structure as if recoiling. The walls were made of green-black stone, veined like old marble. The doorway was narrow and pointed, but no door ever hung from its frame. Within, there were no pews. Only a single altar carved from petrified wood and a circular depression in the centre of the floor, lined with iron rings that had long since rusted. It was a place where no sermons were given, and yet they came, not crowds, never more than one at a time. Travellers, pilgrims, madmen, each drawn by dreams, by voices in rivers, or by a sudden knowledge they had no memory of acquiring, all spoke of a whisper that called them inland. A phrase repeated in different tongues, always the same in meaning. Come kneel where the first mouth opened. One such man was Siamasoff Fionine, a former friar who had abandoned his post after weeks of waking with bloodied hands and ink-stained teeth. He claimed that during prayer he had begun to speak in a language no one recognised, and that the wind in his cell responded with matching syllables. He arrived at Clonmaenach barefoot, carrying nothing but a thin journal and a stone taken from his own well. The final entries of his journal were never inked. They were etched, pressed deep into the pages as if by nail or knife. The chapel is not built on ground. The chapel is built on mouth. It does not open. It remembers how. The next page was empty, save for a drawing, a circle with 12 smaller circles surrounding it, each filled with an eye. After that, nothing. When a shepherd came upon the site some weeks later, he found Siamas's robes folded neatly at the base of the altar. No body, no blood, no signs of departure. Only a shallow pool of rainwater gathered in the centre depression, reflecting nothing of the sky above, and something had changed. The interior walls of the chapel now bore markings. Thin, deliberate grooves like teeth marks or script eroded by time. They pulsed with condensation even on the driest days. Scholars who visited in later decades would try to copy the inscriptions, but their transcriptions never remained legible. Within days, the ink would blur, letters would vanish, or the pages themselves would tear along the copied lines. One friar, Brother Cowlan of Donegal, claimed that upon reading aloud a single phrase carved above the altar, "Beneath all language is one hunger," he lost the ability to speak for 3 months. His voice returned only when he stopped dreaming. There was no clergy at Clonmaenach, and yet those who visited felt they were in the presence of something sacred, or something that used to be sacred, before forgetting what that meant. In 1334, a peculiar occurrence was recorded by the monks of Roscommon. A child, no older than 8, was found at their gates, silent, barefoot, skin etched with pale sigils that burned when touched by sunlight. The child never spoke, but was able to draw in the dirt with terrifying precision. What he drew was Clonmaenach, viewed from below. The monks, confused, frightened, and unsure of what rites might apply, housed the child for a week. On the 7th night, he walked into the chapel alone and did not emerge. Only his breath remained, visible in the cold air, hovering above the altar for several hours, refusing to disperse. And the circle in the centre of the floor, once shallow, had deepened. Those who dared peer into it said it no longer had a bottom. A knight, Sir Dunley of Connacht, journeyed to the chapel years later, having read tales of its strange visitors. He boasted he would sleep upon its altar and wake unscathed, untouched by superstition. His squire reported that the knight had barely laid down before he began to convulse, not violently, but in rhythm, a slow, shaking cadence, like something was speaking through him. When he awoke, Sir Dunley's hair had turned completely white. He spoke only once. The voice is not behind the stone is part of its tongue. He wandered into the peat fields the next morning and was never seen again. The chapel still stands. Weather does not touch it. The bogs do not swallow it. The iron rings in the floor do not rust further. And the circle, that dark, still mouth, widens by a finger's width each year, though no one dares measure it anymore. Locals will not approach the hill. They say it breathes when rain falls. They say that if you press your ear to the altar, you will hear your own voice whispering back, not from memory, but from a time before your first word. And they say the mouth is almost open now, not to speak, but to listen. Listen! In the frost-bitten reaches of Scandinavia's interior, where the sun lingers low for weeks and the land folds into itself under veils of snow and silence, there once stood a settlement known only as Sveltenhaven. No great saga recorded it, no travellers passed through. It was not found on maps, only occasionally mentioned in the personal logs of fur traders, marked by a crude symbol resembling a broken compass. It was not a village in the traditional sense. There were no churches, no marketplaces, no central hearth where neighbours gathered. The homes, all 12 of them, stood equidistant from each other, arranged in a perfect circle with their doors facing inward toward a common square of untouched ground. No path led out. No markings guided the way. It was as though the place had been forgotten on purpose or built for those who had forgotten everything else. And in the centre of that circle stood the Nistesten, the spark stone, a massive slab of dark granite taller than any man, its surface covered in thin grooves like hairline fractures. In winter, when all else froze, the stone remained warm to the touch. In summer, when the air grew soft and heavy, the stone hummed. The people of Sveltenhaven, if they could be called that, lived quietly. They spoke little and only during twilight. No children were ever seen. Their fires burned low and without smoke. Hunters reported they took only what they needed and always returned something afterward. Antler, blood or bone left at the base of the stone. The stone was not worshipped. It was obeyed. The story of Sveltenhaven might have remained buried in the frost had it not been for a man named Eric Halverson, a tax collector from Västerås tasked with locating and documenting unregistered settlements in the region. In the winter of 1377, he set out with 2 assistants, a mule and enough supplies for a month. Only Eric returned. He was found weeks later in the snow, frost-bitten, babbling, clutching a scroll made of birch bark on which a single sentence had been etched with soot and ash. They do not live by light, they live by the spark behind it. When he was finally able to speak clearly, Eric told a tale that few believed. He described the approach to Sveltenhaven as uneventful, silent forests, open plains, nothing unusual. But once within the circle of houses, time itself grew soft. Footsteps didn't echo, snow didn't crunch. His own breath seemed to lag behind him, like smoke reluctant to fade. The people greeted him in silence. They offered food, but not warmth. He was permitted to stay, so long as he did not speak after nightfall, and did not, under any circumstance, touch the Sparkstone. His assistant, Lars, broke both rules. He had laughed, Eric said, called the place a pagan ghost nest, and spit upon the stone. That night the villagers gathered, no torches, no blades, no chains. They simply stood in a ring around Lars's tent and hummed. Eric remembered the sound, not loud, not threatening, like metal cooling after fire, like breath in a throat that never belonged to lungs. By morning Lars was gone. The snow where he'd slept was unbroken. His clothing remained, his voice did not. Eric's second assistant, Annie, vanished 2 nights later, not from disobedience but from dreaming. She had murmured something in her sleep, a phrase no one understood, and the villagers nodded. They placed her boots by the stone, and that was the last he saw of her. Eric had tried to flee. He made it as far as the edge of the circle before he collapsed. Not from cold, from stillness. His limbs refused motion. His thoughts slowed. He felt his own heartbeat stretch thin, as if matching the rhythm of the humming stone. He described it as sinking inward, not into ground, but into quiet. Only the memory of warmth, a fire once held in childhood, allowed him to crawl free. When officials returned to find Sveltenhaven the following spring, the land was bare, no houses, no stone, no footprints, only the trees, bent in a perfect circle, leaning outward as if exhaling. But something had changed in the air. Compasses spun without aim. Matches refused to light. Words forgotten mid-sentence. Whole days misremembered. And at the very centre of the circle, embedded deep in the earth, they found a sliver of black stone, no larger than a finger, warm despite the frost, vibrating faintly. A historian from Uppsala later identified the site as the theoretical location of a pre-Christian myth, the place of the lost spark referenced in a single surviving rune poem. Before fire, before frost, there was the thought of flame. It waits where light does not reach. It burns without burning. It remembers who forgot it. Today, no signs of Sveltenhaven remain, but hunters in the area still speak of nights when, no matter how thick the fire, shadows gather too close, when whispers follow just behind the crackle of flame, when dreams end not in terror, but in silence, and in the last moment before waking, some hear it, low, soft, metallic, a spark, not lit, not struck, remembered, beneath the chalk hills of southern England, where the land dips gently toward the sea and the wind carries the salt of centuries, there lies a forgotten hollow known in the oldest tongue as Harrowmere. It was never a town, nor a church, nor a burial ground, at least not in the ordinary sense. There are no standing stones, no ruins, no grave markers, only a ring of flattened grass, a depression too perfect in shape, too quiet in sound. To stand at its centre is to feel a pressure behind the ribs, a sense of remembrance that does not belong to you. The land keeps no record of who once gathered there. But the oldest stories, passed not through writing but by breath and firelight, speak of the choir that never sang. The first written mention comes from a tattered monastic diary dated to 1189, found deep within the archives of Glastonbury Abbey. Its author, a novice monk named Adric, was sent to tend to a remote outpost where pilgrims reported strange ailments of the tongue, loss of speech, echoing voices, or the compulsion to whisper hymns they had never learned. He describes being taken by locals to a singing place on the downs, where they claimed no sound had ever lasted more than a moment. Even thunder, they said, passed over Harrowmere without echo. Adric stood in the hollow for an hour. He tried to pray, to hum, to shout. Nothing left his mouth. And yet, he wrote, he was heard, not by the villagers, not by himself, but by something. That night he dreamed of 12 figures in a circle, hooded and still, each holding a bowl of silence. Their mouths were open, not in song, but in receipt, as though they were not the ones singing, but waiting for something else to begin. Adric's final entry is brief, only 5 words written with a trembling hand. It listens through the earth. After that, he vanished from record. Centuries later, in 1407, a nobleman named Sir Godric Lothair sought the hollow. He had suffered a fevered illness and awoke with a song in his mind, haunting and unfinished, echoing each morning just before full wakefulness. The melody, he claimed, showed him the path to Harrowmere, though he had never seen a map. His servants camped beyond the ring while he walked alone to its centre, carrying only his sword and a scrap of parchment upon which he had transcribed the melody. They watched as he stood for hours, unmoving. At dusk, a sudden gust of wind blew outward from the hollow, bending trees and extinguishing fires. When the air calmed, Godric was gone. In his place, the parchment now blank and his sword, humming faintly with an impossible tone. That night, the servants heard a chorus rise from the earth. Not singing, not music, a resonance, like the memory of song through stone. They fled by morning. In 1611, a cartographer's apprentice tasked with surveying the chalk hills noted a curious pattern. No birds nested within a half-mile of the hollow. No insects crossed its boundary. Rain fell evenly elsewhere, but never within the ring. His notebook contained a sketch. At the edge of the page, written sideways, a note in smaller script. It is not a place, it is an instrument. Perhaps the most chilling account comes from 1753, penned by a schoolteacher from Hampshire named Eliza Harrow. She had taken to walking the downs after her husband's death, seeking quiet in the fields. She did not know the hollow bore her family name. She described in her diary hearing a low vibration in the soil as she neared the ring. Not loud, but constant, like a held note from a throat that did not need breath. She stood at the centre and, for the first time in years, felt her grief lift. Not gone, but moved aside, as though something had reached in gently to hold it for her. Eliza returned the next day, and the day after. She stopped speaking altogether. Neighbours said she would spend hours beside her garden, arranging stones into spirals, circles, and notched lines. A local vicar attempted to intervene, finding her in the hollow at dawn, hands covered in soil, eyes wide. She looked at him and finally spoke. "It's not finished yet. It needs our silence to begin." She was found lifeless the following spring. In her garden, hidden beneath a stone bowl, was a journal filled with musical notation, but no instrument could play it. The notes were wrong, stacked, inverted, twisted into clusters that defied sound. Modern geologists have studied the Harrowmere Hollow. Their instruments record irregular seismic hums, ultra-low frequencies with no geological cause. Each cycle lasts 12 hours, always beginning at twilight, always ending just before dawn. And beneath the soil something resonates. Not mechanical, not natural, something carved. Archaeologists attempted an excavation once in 1974. The dig was halted within 3 days after every microphone and recorder failed simultaneously. The lead researcher, a man known for his skepticism, walked into the centre of the hollow alone. He stood for precisely 96 minutes. When he returned, he did not speak for the rest of his life. He would later write one sentence on the wall of his study before disappearing. "It is still tuning itself." No one lives near Harrowmere now, but at dusk, some hikers report hearing a deep vibration beneath their boots. Others feel pressure in their jawbones, a strange impulse to open their mouths, not to speak, but to offer, and a few, only a few, begin to hear it in dreams. The choir, the song unfinished. The waiting, not for applause, not for voice, but for silence, complete enough to awaken what listens beneath.